Well, I guess it's actually time for us to get started. Maybe a minute or two past. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for joining us for our Bible class. We want to welcome all of those who are joining us online. Thank you also. We are in Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians 6. We'll begin reading there in just a moment. We are rapidly proceeding to the end of this particular study series. Just to protect ourselves, I have set the end of February as the date to finish, which is give us 4 more weeks after today. I thought that perhaps we may spend a little bit more time on the Christian's armor, but I need to be preparing for our next class, make sure that we have what we need. I'm thinking about the book of James, to study the book of James, which is a very practical, another very practical book. But if you have any other thoughts, you might want to see me. My email address is joeyg@drjoey.net. If you have one of my cards, it's on there. I don't know if it's on the bulletin or not. If that is on there or not, but if you have any thoughts, if you have my telephone number for that matter, you can just text me something if you have any additional information. Ephesians, as we have said, is a letter that was written, I believe, to Christians who are not far removed from their pagan roots. They're new Christians, didn't quite know how to behave. And so Paul writes the first half of the book telling them all that God had done for them, the many blessings that they had in Christ. And then in the last half of the book, he says, okay, this is how you live. And he's covered a number of things. We're in a section actually that begins way back in Ephesians 5 and verse, let's see, all the way back to verse 18. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Be filled with the Spirit is kind of the command. And then he says there are 4 ways to be filled with the Spirit, or at least 4 ways I want to tell you about. One is speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Second participle phrase is sing and make music in your heart to the Lord. The third participle phrase is always giving thanks to God the Father for everything. And then the fourth participle phrase is in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So that submit there kind of covers the next section. Submit is in this case it's used in a reciprocal way. In other words, it could be there are a number of relationships within the body of Christ that you need to submit to the one you're supposed to submit to. Or it could mean, and this is where I kind of come down, the submitting that he speaks of is a reciprocal submitting to one another. You have needs, I have needs. I am to put my needs aside for the sake of yours. You are to put your needs aside for the sake of mine. I can understand that, and I'll tell you a real life situation that really helped. For about 3 years, I worked with a church in San Diego. And that church was growing like gangbusters. We had a significant population within that congregation of Christians who had been Christians for many years. As a matter of fact, the church had been, the current church had come together as a result of a church merger maybe 10 years earlier. And so you really had 2 different congregations represented there from the past. But we had a very active group of young families there that were new to the church and new to the community. Because it was a military town, you had a lot of naval and marine personnel that were members of the church with their families. You had a lot of young adults. We had a huge group of young adults. I'm thinking of generally what you think of young adults. Well, young adults meaning maybe 20 to 30. We had a huge group of those. And as we were working to help prepare the infrastructure to grow that church, there was a shifting of resources. We hired a children's minister to take care of. Actually, that was more for family. That was to take care of families. We went to more of a contemporary styled worship service, which was maybe half contemporary songs and half what we would consider the old classic hymns, and it was about half and half. And some of the older, more established members of the church did not like that. Did not like that they were perhaps losing some of the resources that they were used to having. And so there was basically a conflict that occurred within the church. Older members kind of resenting the younger members for the needs of the younger members, and the younger members kind of resenting the needs of the older members. Instead of there being a big problem with that, what should have happened is people are willing to put aside their needs for the sake of other people. That's what Paul said in Philippians 2 regarding having the mind of Christ. You know, Jesus demoted himself all these times in order to die on the cross for us. He was in heaven and he died the death of a criminal. So Jesus, to have the mind of Christ means to put other people's needs ahead of your own. And that would have been a really good thing for the church to do. But that's not what happened. If we could to submit to one another in the Lord, and that's where I'm getting back to our text, after that long story that probably had very little resonance with some of you, if we could get back to the point of just submitting to one another in the Lord, that makes a big difference. He then goes on and he shares what's called in the literature a household code. And this was very common in pagan literature especially. It was a document that basically instructed people how they were supposed to act within their household in order to meet the mores of society, in order to fit in with society. In this particular case, I think much of this information is being informed by Philemon, who lived in Colossae. And the way, especially the Roman villa was set up, and this is more of, I would say more of a wealthy kind of situation than anything else. But again, it's based more on Philemon than it is perhaps your rank and file Christian. But in a villa type situation, and I would say even otherwise, the man of the household was considered the legal person responsible for everything that happened within that household. There were little rights afforded to the wife, little rights afforded to the children. It was the man that was basically in charge of everything. And depending on his bent, I suppose, on his attitude, there was great potential for abuse or great potential for good. And since we're talking about a converted household, in this particular instance, he's writing Christians, but those who had come out of that background, he is, I believe, mitigating what was considered to be some of the traditional roles of that day. Instead of addressing the husband and saying, now you're the one that's in charge of everything, and you need to make sure that your wife does this, you need to make sure your children does this, you need to make sure your slaves do that. He addresses them mutually. there is a mutual submission that is required. In your society, according to your mores, certainly according to the legalities of Roman law, the husband is the head of the house. And he says, but wives then should submit to their husbands. And he turns then, though, to the husbands and says, you are to love your wife, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what we see is a mutuality being explained there. There is the importance of submission, but there is also the importance of the husband loving his wife. Now he's going to cover two more relationships that were ripe for abuse in that system. He's going to consider fathers and children, and then he's going to consider slaves and masters. And the fathers and children begin in chapter 6, verse 1. And let's begin reading there. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. We'll stop there for a moment. He's addressing the children. The first group that is always addressed in this particular household code is the one that has the least power. He addresses wives first in chapter 5, and then he addresses children first. Greek law, Roman law, even Jewish law, children were expected to obey their parents. I do want you to notice here, it didn't say, children, obey your father, did it? What did it say? Children, obey your parents. So you're kind of bringing the mother in with that as well. Of course, from an Old Testament point of view, that would certainly be the case. Women would be included in something that children. Of course, that is a command from the Ten Commandments, but it would be the parents that would be brought into that equation. But that wouldn't necessarily be the case in Greek and in a Roman situation. It would be the father. You see, children were pretty much raised by the mother until they reached the age of about 7 years old. And then the father basically took over as far as teaching and training and being responsible for the children. He would do so until the children were about 16 years old. That's a good time to give them up, isn't it? About 16 years old, and usually the child would then be turned over to a good friend or someone who was well placed or well skilled for additional instruction, probably for around a couple of years. So it's very interesting, a little different situation than kind of what we're used to here, isn't it? But that was kind of the way it was under Roman law. But it was the father that was in control of everything. And again, depending on the father, would be a great potential of either abuse or of good for the children. Under both Greek and Roman law, and for that matter, to a lesser extent, I think under Old Testament law, the father had complete control over the children. The father could beat them. The father could even put them to death. In Greek and Roman law, if a child was born to the family and it was a girl baby, or if it was a child that was born deformed, or for that matter, if he just didn't want it, it was totally within the father's prerogative to kill the child or to expose the child. It all belonged to the father. If there was a pregnancy that they wanted to terminate, and it was the father's choice to have that pregnancy terminated. And they did have forms of abortion even back then. It was the father. Now, the Hebrews spoke out against that. The Jews spoke out against that. It was not a part of theirs. But I think you can understand how in this particular environment, all the power rested in the father. Yes, sir.
The father was in charge, and there was a child born that he did not want. And you said they did practice an abortion. What if the child was born? Did they have adoption or anything like that?
Was something that could happen. I'm not familiar with the adoption laws at that time, but I doubt if it would occur at the time of a child, at that particular time, or a baby, at the time a baby was born. I imagine if a child was born, it would just be exposed. Now, what Christians later did, they would go and they would find these babies, and they would take them in. Christians, following their Jewish heritage, were always pro-life in that particular instance. And Christians would often take these children when they found them, and they would raise them so that they would not, which, by the way, I think historically it's important for us to know that Christians were pro-life. But pro-life means more than just picketing so that people won't pass laws that are favorable to terminating a pregnancy. To be pro-life means you're willing to adopt these children yourself, children that are unwanted. Otherwise, you're just against something. Pro-life means you're pro-life. And these Christians would go and find the children, and they would, in that sense, there were probably legal means, but I'm not familiar with the legalities personally of that. And I don't know if I repeated that question, but the question was there adoption available? And the idea was, to a lesser extent, perhaps adoption was available. Not the way we would think of it today, but adoption was an option. I would think it would be more of a child that was older that would be adopted in this society.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. That was.
She took him into her family. All right, the command that is given here, again to the lesser party, in this case it would be the children, they are commanded to obey their parents. Maybe we don't emphasize this enough. Children are to obey their parents. Now, the word here for children is teknon or tekna. I don't know the age that they're talking about here. He's going to quote from the Ten Commandments when he says, honor your father and mother. Jesus used that command, honor your father and mother, even to refer to adults. And he applied that, honor your father and mother, to taking care of aged parents. And I would say, by extension, aged grandparents, because Paul later, when he's giving instructions to different churches, he would add grandparents to that particular group of people that needed to be taken care of by children. Obey your parents in the Lord. I don't know what age. Usually when we leave home, maybe when we turn 18, I used to tell my children, now, before their 18th birthday, I said, everything that you've done for the past 17 years, I am responsible for. But as soon as you turn 18, now you are responsible for what happens. If you drive drunk, do not call me to come bail you out of jail. I don't know if I would have done it when they were 16 or 17. I might have let them spend one night in there anyway. But again, I have more responsibility before that age. Usually there is an age where, and usually it's when our kids leave home. Our son came back from college and he lived with us for a while. We tried to make it clear that the rules that we had in this house are the same. Before you left, our kids were pretty decent that way. They didn't really abuse those rules anyway. But if he went somewhere, we wanted him to tell us where he went. We didn't necessarily exercise control over where that was he went, but we still had certain rules that he had to follow. And so I don't know what age, in other words. I would think, though, and this is just my conjecture, that this might have been more of a clannish arrangement, and you might have had more older children living in the household. I think that would certainly be the case with young girls, that they would live in the household until they were married. And so I would imagine the obedience had to do with those that were in your specific household. And again, that's just my conjecture. I tried to look for ages when I was doing this, and I know the information's out there. I just could not find it in the limited time that I had given to my research. But children are to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now, in the Lord, what does that mean? In the Lord may mean since you were all Christians. This is a part of your responsibility to the Lord. He said something very similar to wives in the previous section, where you were to submit to your husbands as to the Lord. He also said that for the wife is the, let's see, I may be trying to remember a different version, but the whole idea is it's a relationship. As to the Lord or in the Lord. That's kind of the situation there. It's within that Christian relationship. Wives were to submit to their husbands. Children were to obey their parents. It could be, though, that in the Lord refers to things that are good. For example, can you conceive of a situation where a parent may force a child to do something that they knew was wrong? Children would have no, at least biblical obligation. They may have a legal obligation in that society, but they wouldn't have a biblical obligation to obey the parents if there was something that was innately wrong. If a father forbade his son from going to church, for example, he might get in trouble legally if he disobeyed his father, but biblically, he had every right to disobey his father, to come and worship God. Yes, Vic?
Honor your father and your mother. But the key phrase, as you pointed out, in the Lord. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of kids, my dad was drunk or whatever. Should I honor him? Mm-hmm. In the Lord. Mm-hmm. Very important.
Vic had mentioned that in the Lord there has also would. How do you honor a father or a mother that say would be drunks or drug users or criminals or abusive? And he emphasized again the phrase "in the Lord" should be used to modify that. But there is also a way that we can honor even people that we would disapprove of and disagree with. We have the responsibility of honoring government officials. Paul says, give honor to whom honor is due. But that doesn't mean I agree with them. They may be very despicable people and devoid of honor, which I think I just described a politician, any politician, did I not? But at the same time, we have the responsibility to honor them. And so in that particular case, I think in regard to a despicable parent, they're still your flesh and blood. They're still the parent. And there's some honor that should be given. But I agree, it would definitely be a different situation for someone that is in the Lord. Then he says, for this is what? Right It is right. It is righteous. That's the place of children. That's what children should do, is obey their parents. Honor your father and mother, that's verse 2, which is the first commandment with a promise. Now this goes all the way back to Exodus 20 and I believe Deuteronomy 5, where the Ten Commandments are repeated. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It's not just a command of God. It is good, practical advice, is it not? Mama told you not to play in traffic for a reason, right? If you go out and disobey Mom and Dad and play in traffic anyway, you may not live long on the earth or in the land that the Lord your God has given you. It just makes sense. I'll tell you the way I have always seen parenting. My job as a parent is to help form responsible, functioning adults. That's my job. It's to help them become responsible, functioning adults. Now, all along the way, my kids are going to make mistakes. They're going to blow it. They're going to do bad things. But as long as they're in my home, they have me as a safety net. I'm there to catch them. Now, that doesn't mean they live consequence-free lives. It doesn't mean I'm going to bail them out of everything that they get involved in. But it means if you're going to make your mistakes at home before your mistakes have a greater possibility of becoming permanent. Because as an adult, whenever I make mistakes, I don't have a safety net, do I? Not really. I don't have a safety net. No one's going to come and bail me out. No one is going to help protect me. But when they're in the home, parents are there. And I believe our job is to help them make mistakes where they can learn from the consequences of those mistakes. Because the consequences of being an adult that makes mistakes are much greater than it is prior to 17. That's where I got that statement about 17. Up till 17, I'm responsible. But as soon as you turn 18, you're responsible legally for what you do. And I know there's exceptions, but still, that's kind of the way generally how the law looks. So it is to our children's benefit to obey parents while they are in the home, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. You have any thoughts there about the responsibility of children to parents? And again we mentioned both ideas, actually three ideas: obey, honor, and then honor in the sense of take care of their parents in their old age. Yes, Jerry.
The word respectful comes to mind for me, that the Lord looks kindly on people that are respectful and not disrespectful.
Right.
Whether it be child or adult.
Yes.
God, Jerry mentioned
that it calls to mind respect or respectful in her mind. That God smiles, He looks kindly on people that are respectful with others as opposed to being disrespectful. There may be people that are not truly worthy of our respect, but we still have an obligation to be respectful to them. And that's especially true because of their position, whatever that position may be. We ought to deal with people with respect. One of my pet peeves is dealing with customer service on the telephone. Would you all agree? And I'm talking about after you go through all the phone tree that they have to get you to the person. Usually that gets people mad enough that they're going to be disrespectful no matter who they talk to after you go through that whole. And don't you hate this? You get to you finally navigate to the place you want, and they're ringing the party that you want, and then their system drops the call. Wow, that is just wow, it just. But when it comes to that, by the time I get to a human being, my civility is almost gone. I'll be quite honest with you. I just don't have the patience to deal with that, and I have to watch it. Tina will tell me, not just when I'm on the phone, but even when I'm talking to her, she will say, "You've got a tone. You've got a tone." My children, my son Joe was a switchboard operator at Sonic. Whenever people will order, and he was, he's the one that dealt with them through the speaker. And whenever I ordered through the speaker, he would say, "Dad, you have a tone." I don't know. I might disagree with him, but I'm more apt to believe Paul Faulkner, who says, when she says you have a tone, you have a tone. But it's hard in instances to be respectful. But still, we need to be respectful to people. It's a good point, Jerry. Any other thing about children obeying your parents in the Lord, for this is right? Verse 4, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Okay, do you see the reciprocal nature of submission as it's being defined here? Father had full control over his family. He could do whatever he wanted to his children. Children are told to obey their parents. Greek, Roman, Jewish, Christian law would all agree to that. Children are to obey the parents. However, then he turns to the father and he says, do not exasperate your children. I'm going to ask you this question. Why didn't he say fathers and mothers do not exasperate your children? And there's not a right answer. I just wondered if you have some thoughts. Go ahead.
I think fathers are a lot better at exasperating.
Bill just said.
It's because fathers are a lot better at exasperating children. And I think you're true about that. I really do. I won't tell you the word. I can't use the word my children call me, not in church anyway, about some of my attitude towards things. But I'm afraid they're right at times, that's the way it's been, because, maybe it's part of just being a man. Maybe it's part of the way I was brought up. I love my dad, but my dad had definite racist tendencies. My dad was definitely misogynistic when it comes to his treatment of my mother. And maybe it was perfectly fine in their household. Every appliance that was ever bought, Dad just brought it home one day. Now, I don't know about that. Tina would have problems if that were me. Vic?
Just by the role that you've already alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
If the father's in charge, he has more capability of being exasperated.
All right, again.
He's making a decision.
Again.
Vic says that if he was recognized as being in charge, there was just a lot more potential of him doing that. And I think that was certainly true in a non-Christian household. If you devalue your children, you're just going to treat them with less value. And I was mentioning my dad. I get some of that from Dad. You may think that when you marry, you're not bringing any baggage with you. But you have baggage that has come from everything you've done and everything you've seen previous to that. And one of the things, Tina came from a house of all women. Guess who was responsible for putting up the toilet paper in their family? The dad. Her dad was the one that always replaced the toilet paper. And so when we got married, guess what Tina expected me to do? In my family of origin, my mom always replaced the toilet paper. So immediately you recognize that we have a problem coming into this relationship. Toilet paper. Does it roll over or does it roll under in your house? There's an old argument. Somebody on the internet came out with the patent for toilet paper, and it was definitely designed to roll over. In my family of origin, the toilet paper always rolled over. In her family of origin, it was always under. That can cause a problem. You bring baggage, and those are just silly examples. You can just imagine all the heavier stuff. My dad's at... Yes. 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 Tina will leave a perfectly good tube of toothpaste and buy a new one just because she's not willing, to work her way up. Family of origin, there are a lot of little things. I was once counseling a couple. They were engaged, they were planning their wedding, and they almost called it off because of the way he put a light bulb, the kind of light bulb that he put in on the back porch. I don't know if he put in a colored light bulb and she expected a yellow one. Some people would use yellow bulbs. I don't know if he put in a yellow one and she wanted a clear one, or vice versa. But they came to blows over that. I mean, it's amazing how our past affects us in marriage. And like I said, those are just some silly examples. There are some heavy ones. So, we all come to marriage, and I think especially men, with certain ideas about wives or about children or things such as that. And so maybe we do have a greater capability of being more abusive in those relationships. But he says, fathers, do not exasperate. Actually, the way the King James Version translates it, do not provoke them to wrath. That's what it literally says. Do not provoke them to wrath. Exasperate kind of pictures the entire process, provoking them to wrath, and then how they feel afterwards, that no matter what they do, they can't please the Father. What do you think provoking to wrath would mean in a household?
Yes.
Well, it would mean treating your kids like they're prisoners, or like you're a drill instructor.
Okay.
You got them there; they can't get away.
Okay.
So they got no escape. So you could just hammer them and
Harold says it's if you treat your children
like you're a drill instructor. Just continue to hammer them. Nothing that they do is right. Nothing will please you that they do. And do you think some fathers are that way? My dad was a strict disciplinarian. I don't think he was really authoritarian as far as some of that goes, but he was really a very strict disciplinarian in our family. We didn't want to cross him in any way. Anyone else? Provoking children to wrath. What do you think?
Exasperating. What might that look like? Yes. Push them to the point I couldn't.
Where they take some kind of revenge.
Someone repeat that.
Push them to the point where they might seek some sort of revenge.
Okay, all right, yeah, certainly.
To the point of rebellion. Now, none of us, reason I made the quip earlier about 16-year-olds is usually it's about that age, maybe even a little younger than that children begin to assert their independence. And that really is a good thing. It's a good thing that children assert their independence. You really don't want to raise children that are totally dependent upon you. You want them assert. So you understand that in some form or fashion, teenage rebellion, it just is something that's going to happen because of that. It is a God-given process to help them become what they need to become. So understand that's certainly the case. It's our job as parents is to kind of help them navigate through that. And if we can do it without further provoking them, I know, have you ever had your kids tell you that they hated you? I have. I hate you usually because I forbade them from going someplace or something like that, or I said no to a request that they made. If we can I tell you what I feel in my gut is when they object to something. I say, "Who told you this was democracy?" You know, maybe that's getting a little close to that authoritarian kind of attitude. Help your children work through some of those things. Obviously, harsh discipline would fall in that category of provoking your children to wrath. Yes, sir.
To know your Bible, to refer to Scripture when you talk to them.
Yes, it would.
And the Bible does, I think, leave the door open for corporal punishment when it comes to children. In that particular instance, that it is open. I mean, I paraphrase: "Spare the rod, he that spareth the rod hateth his son." I think is what the Old Testament says. I've never beaten my child with a rod, but I think there is a place. But you need to understand that corporal punishment doesn't really get you anywhere. Now, when a child is small, maybe a little pat on or a little slap on the hand or a little something such as that can get them to associate that there's some behaviors that are acceptable and some behaviors that are not acceptable. But you can make a child behave, but you cannot change a child through corporal punishment. You know what I'm saying? As long as you're holding the switch, you can make them do just about whatever you want them to do. I think the place, if you're going to use that, is usually when the children are younger and you're trying to associate that there are consequences with behavior. That is the key to discipline, by the way. There are consequences to behavior.
Yes.
Jamie and I used to work with the developmentally disabled, and we used M&Ms far more than we used anything else.
Okay.
In other words, you reward the behavior, and by simply rewarding and setting up the environment, the other doesn't occur as frequently, and then when they receive the reward, that's usually the direction they'll go.
Yeah, positive
reinforcement is what they said. Vic mentioned that when they were working with the developmentally disabled, you said that often giving M&Ms for positive behavior could be very helpful. And you can shape behavior through that. And it is much stronger. What I have tried to do, and we'll get into this here. Let's see, are we past time yet? Well, we're right at the time. He says, instead bringing them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. The word training is discipline, but understand discipline has two sides. There's instructive discipline and there is corrective discipline. If your child is running through the house screaming and you have a headache and you grab your child and you spank them because they're hurting your head, that's not exactly consistent form of parenting. You know what I'm saying? If you have explained to your children that we don't run through the house screaming, and that if you do, there are consequences, you'll have to sit in the corner, time out for 10 minutes or something similar to that. Here is the behavior. If you do this, there will be consequences to that behavior. And then if you are consistent to follow through with those consequences, that's helpful. We really don't have time to talk about the training and instruction of the Lord. We'll pick up there next week because I want to have a message for parents about some of our responsibility when it comes to teaching children. And that will be next week. Thank you for your time.